This talk is about 5 years of research in Android security, and this is more like an academic's point of view, so I'm sorry for that. And also, when I set up this talk, and I looked at this, like 5 years of Android security research, this is like a very vast area, so my thought was like, how do I squeeze this into 40 minutes of talk? So I had to make, unfortunately, a small selection of topics I will cover, and I hope at the end of the day you are still happy with the selection that I did. What I selected, I grouped in 3 categories. So the good, this is essentially research that made it a little bit out of the academic area and has seemingly a positive impact on the overall security of the Android ecosystem. The bad, which is not bad research, so I would have a lot of problems with my colleagues if I would basically start blaming here. This is about new attack vectors that have been identified as part of this research effort. And the ugly, these are results research has accomplished, which are still open issues and which have very seemingly or very visibly a negative impact on the current security of the Android ecosystem. So why do we care about smartphone security in the first place? Because over the last 8 years, we basically had a paradigm shift in the way how we communicate mobile. So smart devices, smart phones, tablets have become like the central hub for our communication. We can extend them with our apps. They have a nice set of sensors that we can leverage. So this picture nicely illustrates this. On the top and on the bottom, you both see like the election of a new pope. And the difference is pretty clear. On the top, if you look carefully, you will find one Nokia device. And on the bottom, you will see a lot of iPhone, tablets from Samsung, etc. And the Pope probably is also happy that he was selected in 2013, because in 2016-17, he probably would have encountered a slightly different crowd in front of the Peter's place. Smartphones, this paradigm shift is also very obvious in our society. For instance, psychologists found a complete new phobia for people who are basically attached to their mobile phones. So they basically see that people have panic attacks if they are out of network coverage, if their battery is empty, etc. They cannot use their smartphone anymore. It's basically just a brick. And the consequence is that these nomophobes, most of them, they don't even turn their devices off anymore. So even my device probably is in the 4-digit numbers in uptimes by now. And also in our use language, we can see development, this paradigm shift. So we have the zombies denoting people who are glued to their smartphones. And of course, we see this appification, this mobile context scanning into other contexts. So augmented virtual reality is the latest trend. The appification of our smart home wearables are already here, and also cars should be appified. So this is all fun, but from a security privacy point of view, it's a little bit more dire, because essentially we concentrate all our private data on these devices on which we so much rely on our daily lives. So they know who we know. They know what we want to do next. They can track us in a sense of GPS, maybe our surroundings, so over the sensor arrays that they have. And we do not only entrust this information to these devices themselves, but also to all the applications that we install on them. So I think for this crowd, this is pretty much, I'm talking here to the wrong crowd. You're probably all aware of this. So to who is basically endangering our data? So the attack spectrum that has been identified here is very wide. On the one hand, you have sophisticated hardware attacks like fake base stations, USB chargers with modified firmware that then over the USB interface attack your firmware on your devices. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have sophisticated runtime attacks, return-oriented programming, etc. that is also known as the non-mobile area. Research and also this talk, however, focused mostly on this middle part. This new threats to privacy violations, how is malware essentially redesigned? How can it use, for instance, this vast APIs that the applications have at their disposal to access data? How can they leverage them? Before I go into this research areas themselves, I want to quickly give a very, very short primer on Android security to basically just pick everyone up and bring you on the same page. So Android security design, as for other mobile systems as well, dictates that every application on your device has to be essentially treated as a distinct, separate security principle that also should be separately sandboxed. That means that every application essentially in the sandbox can use its own local resources, but if it wants to access or interact with system resources, for instance, the APIs that it has to user data, the internet, etc., it has to get additional privileges for this. And this kind of sandboxing is enforced on Android by the underlying Linux operating system. Let us look into this sandbox itself. And the first thing that has to be clear at this point is that also on Android, you write your applications in Java code and then compile this into DEC code, which is forms like the app code per se in most cases, which is then executed in this Dalvik virtual machine or Android runtime. That by design, on Android, you can include native code. So this was from the beginning a design decision in the system that native code can be included for the simple reason, for instance, performance, if you need high-performance code. That also means, in contrast to, for instance, if you look at desktop PCs where the Java virtual machine can form a security boundary, on this mobile system here, this orange blob is not a security boundary. So any kind of security enforcement you would put here can be easily circumvented with native code. The design decision, how the system was essentially designed, was that the security boundary instead is the user ID. So if you want, Google abused here the multi-user support on Linux in order to establish every application as a kind of separate user with its own user ID, under which all its processes are executed, and also private files like a home directory is being established. So these application sandboxes are separated at this process boundary and through the user ID. And from a design perspective, because Google, when they designed Android, they didn't have like a long red tail of legacy code on which they had to build. From a design perspective, this was actually like a nice, refreshing, and cool design feature. Because if you look into the literature, it basically says if you design your system, you shall compartmentalize. So split up your code into small compartments, isolate them, apply least privilege on each compartment. And now if an error occurs in one compartment, it is isolated to this compartment. It does not spread to the rest, in contrast to, for instance, monolithic designs, for instance, the Linux kernel. And this is directly reflected in this design of this mobile operating system. So you can directly see this bridge that every app is basically its own compartment. If one app is now being compromised or is acting malicious, it should not affect the rest of the system or other compartments. And this was a nice new feature. Google designed the system quite open, so these compartments can freely interact with each other over different channels. For instance, inter-process communication, component communication is an abstraction of IPC. And if you have such a system where free communication is possible, you have to regulate it, and this is where this privilege, these permissions come in on Androids, which are basically access control rights an application must hold to access, to communicate with another compartment. So you want to call the application framework to retrieve data, you need the necessary permission. You want to contact another application, potentially you need a permission defined by this other application. By default, there are 140 of those permissions for instance, the application framework on default apps. And these permissions are bound to the user ID. That means every compartment has its own set of privileges. And the literature, this is called an ambient authority. So every piece of code that is being executed in one of these sandboxes, application sandboxes, has the privileges assigned to the user ID under which it is executing. The enforcement is pretty simple, can be summarized in this simple picture. If you have an application that wants to access a service component here, and it has the necessary permission that the service component requires, the system will allow you to communicate. For instance, trigger functionality, retrieve data. If you don't have it, the system will block you. So the more interesting question was then, how do applications get these permissions? And in Android, the design was here basically to put the user here on the spot, to delegate this access rights to the applications. So if you install an application like this color flashlight, the user is presented on older Android versions with a screen like this that basically says this compartment, this application requests access to be able to, for instance, control hardware. And then the user was on the spot and basically had to make a decision if this request is reasonable. And if you consider it reasonable, safe, you install the application. But similarly, if this application is a little bit fishy or even malicious, and for instance, it's a simple flashlight app, but it wants to also send premium SMS, make premium calls that can be very costly, it is your responsibility to decide that this is quite fishy behavior, and you should be able to put in a spot to basically deny this. On newer versions, this was replaced. You get this runtime dialogues. So at runtime, while the app is already executing, there's this pop-up coming, telling you, oh, this application wants to access right now. It requests access to, for instance, in this case, I think it's the SMS data. And the user can then also, if he is aware of the settings on the right side, later go there and revoke or re-grant this kind of privileges, which is a little bit more fine-grained. But from the user's perspective, nothing has actually changed. Still, when this dialog comes, you are on the spot. You have to decide if you grant it or not. And if you don't grant it, you essentially have to decide, well, does the app work correctly? Do I re-grant it later? Do I revoke something later? You're still in the spot as a user. So this was the status quo from where research essentially started. So let's look into some of the lines of research that have been done. And if I ask you, what is Android security research? I would bet that the majority would say it's about the platform. So how do we enhance the software stack on these devices? So how can we improve the kernel, the middleware, etc.? But what has become very apparent over the last years is that there are many more actors in this ecosystem that have a quite severe impact on what is actually happening privacy and security-wise. So it has been identified that the different vendors, like Sony, Samsung, etc., they customize the software stack and introduce new vulnerabilities. App developers, of course, can be a source of errors, but also the tool chains they're using have been identified as a root cause. And lastly, apps cannot be seen as the app, meaning the app developer is acting malicious, but they often include third-party code libraries or web content, which can be a source of attacks. So let's look at some lines of work that have been conducted. I will here not go very deep, but summarize rather these results and point out some problems. This is research that has seemingly had a positive impact. So one of the big research areas in the past and still ongoing is how to improve application vetting. For the simple reasons that in this ecosystem, you have the markets, which streamline for you, for the end user, the process of finding, installing, and also paying for apps. And as such, they are a very nice choke point where you can put a first line of defense, so filter out malware, etc. Or they can also be a very powerful attacker by withholding, for instance, updates. I will here now focus more on the, or only on the defensive part. And the interest is clear. This is an economic reason here. Because if you're operating a store and you become known as someone who is distributing malware, where the user is running high risk, your user is running away. With the users, your developers are running away. And with users and developers, your revenue is running away. So you have an economic interest in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And in the beginning, this was not always so clear. So early research or early studies had actually shown here 2010, 2011, that malware became more and more an increasing issue in this market. And this was a clear call for action at this time. And a lot of work has been invested in how to improve the situation. So from the research end, there were clearly advances in how to statically, dynamically analyze applications, new ways to leverage heuristics to detect malware. And if you look, for instance, at the infrastructure that Google has built, you have a massive network of monitoring, actually, the ecosystem. So telemetry data collection, like, for instance, also the safety net, etc. There's unfortunately no new ground truth except for what the markets report themselves on how this exactly has improved. So take this with a grain of salt. Advances are there. We know that these techniques have been applied, and seemingly the risks are getting lower by now. But I said take this as a self-reporting by Google, for instance, with a grain of salt. An open problem, in contrast, is app piracy. So if I want to make a few quick bucks, with an application, I don't sit down, develop a new fancy idea, and sit there for several weeks writing the application. If I think a little bit more economically for myself, I can just look what are the hip top apps on the market right now, get them, pirate them, change a little bit the user interface maybe to hide it a little bit, to make it not so obvious, upload it again, and hope users will choose my application over the original one. And in fact, this is an increasing problem. So this is hard to investigate. One of the most accurate or most prevalent studies here is they looked at the traffic, specifically revenue traffic, so to advertisement networks, and they identified that there are actually large clusters of such clones. So this kind of app piracy is still a prevalent issue. And this will also have effects because they estimate here, the authors estimated it to be like 10 to 50% of revenue loss for a developer who was victim to piracy. And of course, if this becomes a more pressing issue, this again will have put you back in this loop, like developers running away, maybe they don't like your market anymore, etc. There are research proposals on improving this, but we cannot say yet how much they have been adapted and how far this will improve. The other area is, of course, improving the operating system itself. This is where the bulk of research went. So again, I don't want to go into all the details. I just want to highlight like one concrete line where effect can be seen, and this was hardening the system. So the vendors, Google as the maintainer or maintainer of the Android source code itself, they adopted techniques that you know from the non-mobile system. So for instance, improved memory management to harden the software here, the processes here against software exploitation. You have syscall filters, and they also increasingly integrate, for instance, hardware security features, so hardware isolated trusted execution environments to protect sensitive code. One thing that was clearly adapted from research here was the integration of mandatory access control. So they basically tightened the mandatory access control. I mentioned at the beginning, initially it was all based on the user ID. So if you gained root user, you basically won the system. And this has been basically, with mandatory access control, the bar has been put much higher for the attacker. So now, even if you have root privileges on the file system, your access can be still very much constrained on where you can go, if you can p-trace other processes, etc. So basically, the step of doing reconnaissance for further attacks can also, the bar can be much lifted higher here. This is something where we see positive effects, but I'm not saying this is perfect. We are far from perfect. So one nice use case where you can see that this hardening still has to be continued, has to be improved is, for instance, root providers. So the same mechanism that locks down the system essentially to harden it is also taking a little bit control away from the end user. So on my Mac here, for instance, I have a root shell, I have administrative privileges. I don't know how many of you have this on, if you have an Android phone or even iPhone, how many of you have this on your end user device, on your mobile one. So you're giving up these privileges. Not everyone is happy with this. So there's a whole ecosystem for those people that want to gain the administrative privileges again. So you have this one-click routing solutions. You install an app, you click root the device, exploit code is being executed, and in the end, you should have the escalated privileges. And they are in this cat and mouse game with this hardening, and they have been very good, for instance, at finding new kernel exploits, because you have to attack the kernel in order to compromise the mandatory access control to escalate the privileges. And as said, this highlights the system is still open. There is no, we still haven't reached the point. And especially this becomes critical because if those root providers, they do not protect the exploit code properly inside the applications they ship out, this can be easily adapted by people who do not want to help the user to root the device, but who have other intentions. The problem doesn't have to be always intricate like this. It can be also a little bit simpler. Mandatory access control, like SE Linux, is operating at the operating system level. So I talked about, for instance, the file system that you can constrain for the root account. But on top of this, you still have the application framework. And also they somehow have to do access control checks, for instance, for permissions. And right now, for instance, the situation looks like this. Even if you have a root shell and you can't access anything on the file system, as soon as you run into a permission check on the middleware level, so you contact another application, you want to tell the application, do something for me or give me some data, and your process is running with root, the system will automatically grant you any of the permissions, even the ones that shouldn't be even available to third-party applications. And the last thing, before I come to the more funny part, to attacks, is inline reference monitoring. So there's a whole line of work on how to empower the end user without relying on support by the operating system vendors. So the question was originally motivated by something like this. If I present you with this screen, so you have to approve the privileges. These screens only tell you what the application could potentially access. But the question is then in the end, if you spin this around in your head right now, the question is rather, how does the application actually at runtime use this? So what is she actually doing with these permissions? If I'm not happy with what she is doing, it is doing with it, can I define filters? So I don't want to share my whole address book, I just want to share a subset of my address book. Can I configure this? Or can I set a context? So if the application has the capability of taking pictures, maybe I want to restrict it to take pictures when I'm actually interacting with it, or when there's a clear transparency to taking the pictures, so no background pictures, etc. There's a lot of work on how this can be implemented at the operating system level, and there it's actually quite easy to put these monitors in to enforce something like this. The problem was you rely on the operating system vendor to ship these changes, to integrate them, or on the end user to be able to flush a custom ROM, something like Copperhead OS, etc., or CyanogenMod. So this is not really desirable if you want to push this quickly. The alternative is you make an app out of it. So you put this enforcement that empowers the user into a separate app. The problem is, I just talked about the compartmentalization and even reinforcing it with mandatory access control, etc. So such applications won't have the privileges to help you in this way. And this is actually also one of the reasons why, for instance, antivirus software, etc., all these defensive mechanisms, they have hurdles. They cannot integrate themselves so deeply into the system as you, for instance, they could on your desktop operating system. So the idea here was something to actually put the monitoring in the app itself as a workaround, essentially. So to create a self-monitoring app. And this usually works by rewriting the application code. So if you have this uncharted app that makes a call to open a connection by calling a system library, you rewrite this code, redirect control flow to the injected monitoring code where you enforce your access control policy, and only if the policy allows it, you forward this call to the original core side. So essentially, you rewrite the app in such a way as the original developer have ideally had done it. And such a solution can be easily implemented as an app, shipped to end-user devices. So such a rewriting app can take another app as an input, rewrite it, install it, and then you have the self-monitoring app installed. But, or before we come to that, use cases would be, for instance, for Twitter, or other, like WhatsApp, other messengers. They usually upload your address book to the server for friends finding, for connecting you to the other people you know, but they usually upload more than you actually want. So you could use this rewriting to filter here that only friends and only a subset of this friends' data is uploaded. Or you can use this for kind of hot patching. And Mondo, in a very old version, for instance, leaked data over HTTP. And with rewriting, you could, for instance, rewrite it such a way that you enforce an HTTP everywhere at this point. But while this is nice and empowers the users immediately, so we don't have to wait a year until a new operating system version is shipping with these features, it is an interim solution. Because the monitoring code is running in the same process space as the code it is monitoring, so there is no strong security boundary. If the app is actually malicious and is aware of the rewriting procedure, it can easily attack the monitoring code, revert the changes you did. Moreover, the rewriter has to find the sites or the code fragments it has to rewrite, and this can be fooled by simple obfuscation techniques in some cases, or by just going through native code. So while it had an immediate positive impact, solutions, or actually products building on this technique, have a significant user base. It is an interim solution. Okay, with this, let us go to some more fun part, the bad. One problem set is if you interact with your smartphone, you usually see only one app in the foreground. So there is no like multi-window on the usual devices unless you have some newer tablet. And this caused some problems. One of them was actually one that was here identified by researchers here in Bochum, is like UI redressing. So it means you trick the user in clicking something he didn't even think he's clicking. So you want the user to press this buy for $200 buttons. You overlay this original button with some other button, and if he then presses this go here for funny pictures, this click event is actually given to the buy button. And Android supports you in implementing such attacks with the system alert permission. To illustrate this better, I shamelessly copied here some presentation from Markus, who actually opened this here in the morning. So he has some attack app here at Azure CCS. So he's opening it, and this looks like a normal user interface with some text and a button on the bottom of the app. So now if the user clicks on this seemingly button, you see on the top this green icon popping up. By clicking this, he actually triggered a phone call. But the attack app doesn't have the permission to initiate phone calls. It actually tricked the user in doing this. So how did it do it? Markus at this point then will put this overlay, this button and this text in a semi-transparent point to make this a little bit more clear. So you can see this button and the text now appeared. It's semi-transparent. This is actually an overlay. The app in the background opened the actual dialer and now tricked the user on clicking exactly this position here, and by this initiating itself the phone call. And since the user initiated this, the application doesn't need permission to do so because the user wanted to do this. And if you make it a little bit more complex, for instance, letting the user chase like this figure here across the screen, you can trick the user into clicking at strategically chosen points and thus doing even more complex interactions with, for instance, settings apps. So he showed in his example, this is like from 2014, that even with like 4 to 5 clicks where you trick the user, you can initiate a factory reset or install arbitrary applications from the Play Market. This is adopted from the web domain and it relies on the system alert permission. Because system alert permission is also popular in ransomware, with the newest version of Android coming in this year, system alert will be abandoned for obvious reasons, for security reasons. But still, we can mount such attacks using side channels. So there was one work that actually realized that if you interact with a phone and you switch between these windows, this will have an effect on the shared memory that every application can observe. So now you can, if you have a specific target app, victim app in mind, you can essentially recognize which changes in shared memory correspond to which window change. And you can basically, you have over the side channel, you know when which screen is in the foreground, and you can again use this to phish the user. Also here, small attack video. On the right, on the left, you see where the logging output is coming, the attacker server essentially, the right is the victim phone. The attack app is already installed, and it is actually already running, and it is in the background already monitoring this shared memory between all the applications, and the victim app will be the banking app, and banking app for which this attack was specifically designed. So you can see that the attack app doesn't use any kind of permission, so you see it only has the internet permission, which today every app auto-grants, actually get it auto-granted. So now the user is interacting with the victim app, and you can see over the side channel, the attacker has a pretty accurate view which window of the banking app is currently in foreground. So he knows where the user is currently interacting. Now, if the user continues his interaction with the victim app and he comes to a screen which is sensitive, like for instance a login screen where we actually want to then phish the data, what happened now is this on the right side is not the banking app anymore. It's the phishing app who put itself into the foreground. So it knew the login activity was opened and opened its own activity, which looks exactly like the login activity. So when the user now entered it, the data was stolen, an error was thrown because, of course, the login doesn't work from the attacker app, and this is now the original app again. So for the user, the switch of applications wasn't even visible because animations were turned off. So if you know where the user is currently in another app in the navigation, you can phish them like this. And the underlying problem is that, for instance, in contrast to, for instance, like the browser domain, we don't have a trusted GUI element that shows us what is the foreground activity. The same with the overlay. If we would have an indicator who is currently the app with whom we are interacting, who is shown to us, maybe the user could be more vigilant at this point. And another popular attack in the recent past is using gyroscope and accelerometer side channels. So this is data that is not permission protected because it is considered as not security privacy sensitive. And if you followed the news, you will have seen several of these kinds of attacks. So by monitoring the movement of the phone over gyroscope and accelerometer, you know how the phone is tilting, how it's moving. And the intuition is now, if the user is interacting with the phone and entering, for instance, something into a virtual keyboard, by pressing the button on the virtual keyboard, slight movements of the phones are triggered. And by monitoring these movements, you can then infer back where approximately on the phone, on the virtual keyboard, the press event happened, and from this you can derive which button was pressed. So if it moved like this, we know it was somewhere on the left side, it was an S. If something like this, it was also on the left side, but slightly different location, it could be an A, and you can infer this. And the nice thing is, the most recent attack, I think like 2 weeks ago, that was in the media, was that this gyroscope data is also exposed in the browser to JavaScript, so you can even mount it as a remote attack by having JavaScript monitoring this data and then infer what the user is currently doing in the browser, for instance. And this was used to steal pins for, I think, banking websites. And with this, let me come to the ugly part. So these are problems that are open that have a negative impact on the security right now. And one of the biggest and open problems is to put the responsibility for this approving the permissions onto the user's shoulders. There are several studies that show that users are not even aware of this permission screens, and if they are aware of it, they do not comprehend it, and they make a default choice, so click through. And this is, since 2010 until today, still being actively exploited to exploit the user by basically requesting permissions and having the user confirm it. The idea of this runtime dialogues was to give the user more context, because the pop-up is coming ideally in the context where the app currently wants to use this permission. So the user thinks, okay, it requests at this specific point in the execution, so probably it needs it right now. So how does this assumption hold up? In fact, it actually holds up very, very badly, because 75% of all permission users actually occur when, for instance, the user is not even interacting with the device. So the screen is off, or it's an invisible service in the background. So the context mismatches. So if you approve in one context, the permission is used in some other context. Even if you would say the user should be in the loop, so every access should be approved by the user, the high frequency on the bottom, this reading SMS, browser history, etc., this would overwhelm every user, because you're spending your whole day pressing allow, deny, allow, deny, allow, deny. So it's an open problem. Where are potential solutions heading here? So some of the interesting ideas that I want to just list here are user-driven access control. So essentially, if the application, for instance, wants to take a picture, this has to be triggered by user interaction. So the user has to press a certain button, and then this permission for taking pictures is delegated to the app temporarily. You could also use generate more transparency for the user. So answer the question, what is the app actually doing at runtime? So there were some ideas of, from the source code of the app, under the assumption you have very precise analysis techniques, you generate a security-centric description that tells the user this app will request this data and do the following with it. And the most interesting part is something that will actually be presented in 2 weeks is you replace the user. You take him out of the loop. So they use here machine learning techniques, a neural network that is trained with the user's privacy preferences, and this network in the background will answer in this high frequency, like several thousand requests per minute, whatever, will answer for the user, allow, deny. And they could actually show for, if you train this specifically to users, this can be a very nice approach to support the user in this. Another problem area is SSL, and this is like a general network security. So I guess you all pretty much know how SSL TLS is working. So you have a leaf certificate to which you want to connect. You have to validate it. So you have to validate the chain, and you have to validate that certificate matches the right server. Browsers, as our primary means to interact with websites, are very good at this, but in the non-browser domain, including applications, the developers have to implement this validation logic. And if they mess this validation logic up, they cannot get any security guarantees from what SSL TLS can offer you. And it has been shown this is a pathological problem. App developers are very bad at implementing this. So there was some very early study, and they basically showed there are several apps in the tested ones that accept all certificates, accept all host names, so you have no guarantee from SSL TLS. And the sad part is that even a third of the interviewed developers who basically claimed they're IT experts, they couldn't even tell the difference between HTTP and HTTPS. And this is not restricted to like crappy apps with tens or hundreds of downloads, but actually you can find it also in the top apps. So there's a large number of apps affected by these programming mistakes. So developers, they don't have an understanding what is the difference, authentication, confidentiality, etc. Or maybe they have requirements from the clients to accept self-signed certificates, and they have no better way to do this. And also Stack Overflow has been shown as one of these nice sources where code has been copied from. So allow all hostname verifier to get rid of your exceptions. Or you have a certification path exception, well, return true here or return true here. And this is a code you can actually re-identify in actual apps. So people actually took this code and looked where can we find this in apps on the store, and you're surprised how many people copied this part of code. How is Google working against this? So they want to have network security configuration was introduced, so you can do this now declaratively. So avoid programming mistakes, and we will see how this will pan out in the future. I'm coming to the end. So one area in the network thing is also web views. So web views allow you to integrate web content inside your application. So for instance, if you want to build it completely in HTML5, you also have a large tail of SSL, TLS problems here, but the more interesting part is if this web content and the host app interact. One way to interact is this JavaScript interface. So you can attach to your web view this interface, which then allows web content over JavaScript to call in your Java-based host application. So for instance, this injected object to string will call to this JAS object, which is actually part of the host app. So web content can trigger functionality in host app. And the bad thing is this JavaScript interface is exposed globally in the web view. That means any kind of JavaScript that is coming into the web view can use it. There is no same origin policy, whatever, in place. And Google's recommendation is don't load untrusted web content in your web view. So you have the usual candidates, XSS, weak TLS, how you can get your JavaScript into this web view, same as in the browser domain. The more nice idea is these apps, if they are like powerful HTML5 apps, they also act with your device local resources, like they're reading your context data, they're reading Wi-Fi names in the proximity, etc. So why not set up Wi-Fi that actually is called script alert something? If this data is then really over this JavaScript bridge, then coming into the web view, you have a code injection over channels that are rather specific to this mobile domain, or creating contacts that have this JavaScript, that actually have JavaScript as name or data. And the last part I want to get into before I end this talk is the danger of third-party libraries. So applications contain a huge amount of external data, for instance, for utility, social media integration, etc. So Facebook here clearly leading it. And also advertisements are integrated into applications in form of libraries. So what is the difference between advertisements on the web and advertisements in your app? The difference is, on the left side, this advertisement is part of an iframe. That means the same origin policy in the browser will prevent malicious advertisements from attacking your website. On the other side, the library code is a fixed part of the app code. So essentially, you have a static linking, if you want so. And that means it's running under the same user ID. It has all the privileges of the host app. And advertisement libraries actively exploit this fact, access location data, which seems reasonable. You want to have localized data. But for instance, sending out your contacts and your call logs, reading your installed applications, which can clearly identify you as a user, so there's a clear de-anonymization here, or even loading content over the internet, over insecure channels, this is beyond what such a library should do inside an application. Not only are they actively bad in the sense, they are in very many cases also outdated. So if you look into the top applications on the Play market right now, majority of the included libraries are outdated by a good amount of versions. So this is, for instance, the version distribution for the Facebook library inside among the top apps. And the problem is here, application developers don't update these libraries when they release new apps. They actually ship application updates much more often than libraries updates are released. So they could update at many points, but they don't. And the consequence is, for instance, if you look at Facebook in version 3.15, there's a very severe account hijacking vulnerability in the Facebook lib. The bottom graph, this red thing, you see the time to fix, or until a patch was released by Facebook, was very quick. But the green part is how many application updates or even new applications were put onto the market, still containing the vulnerable version. And the top graph, this blue thing, is how many actually fixed it. And you see, application developers, they stick to this. They have probably a one-time setup. They stick to this, and they still, even new applications are shipped with a vulnerable version. And this is a problem that clearly has to be tackled. So how do we improve the updatability of third-party library code in this environment? And with this, because I get signals, I want to end this. So the takeaway is a very wide area. There's a lot of stuff you can consider where you can actually do harm, where we need improvements. And I hope I could, well, scare you a little bit, but also you could take something away from this for your daily job, etc. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I open for questions.